Let's talk about the Venetian Schiavona. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now I'm at Olympia Auctions looking at some of the amazing lots in the upcoming auction, which is going to be on the 4th of December 2024. Now recently a number of people on my channel were asking me to talk more about Schiavona, and you know what? They've got a bunch of them in this auction. So I thought what a great opportunity to have a little chat about them. Now, first of all, for anyone who doesn't know what this is, it's a type of, or at least what most people think it is, it's a type of basket-hilted sword from Venice. Okay, now, these first appear in the 16th, 17th century, but they have their roots in the 14th and 15th century. We'll talk about that in a second. But this type of basket hilt that you might see, for example, available in auctions like this one, usually dates to the mid-17th all the way through to the end of the 18th century. So they actually have quite a long life, a bit like Highland basket hilts. Now I think when you talk about a basket hilted broadsword, a lot of people are thinking about Scottish swords, but there are German basket hilts, there are Saxon basket hilts, there are Venetian basket hilts, and there's others. And what we're going to be looking at here is the brand of basket hilt which evolved in Venice. Now, this started off its life with the Schiavoni, or Slavic mercenaries who were operating in Venice. So Venice, a very important maritime military power and trading hub, but they had their tentacles spreading all over the place, including into the Balkans. So they obtained mercenaries, they hired mercenaries in the Balkans, in areas such as Croatia and Serbia, who served in Venetian forces. Now, they came with their own fashions, their own language and culture, and they brought some of that to Venice with them. And one of the things they brought with them were their swords, or at least their preference in sword types. And that means if we go back to the 15th century, so the 1400s, we see swords like this, which have a characteristic rectangular pommel with a little knob in the middle. They have usually broadsword blades, so quite cut-centric blades, not as tapered and pointy as some of the arming swords you find in other parts of Europe in the 15th century. They tend to be broader, more spatulate tipped. And by the end of the 15th century, they have these characteristic curled, double curled quillons or guard like this. Okay. Now, if you picture this hilt, but you start to evolve side rings and bars and a swept hilt, what you end up with is the Schiavona, the basket hilt that so many people are familiar with from the later 16th and 17th centuries, and in fact, as I mentioned, carried on into right the way through the 18th century. But they keep some common features. One of the common features that Schiavona usually have is this type of broadsword blade, so a fairly flat and flexible and fairly broad cutting blade. But in addition to that, they sometimes have these curled elements within the basket of the Schiavona itself, and they have forms of angular pommel. I won't say they're always rectangular, because we later on get a form of pommel which is sometimes known as a cat's head pommel, because it looks like it's got little ears like that cat from the meme. So if you imagine a cat's face on here, so sometimes they're likened to the head of an animal, but by and large we can say that their pommels are angular, so they're not globose, they're not round, they're not the more typical pommel shapes that we find elsewhere. So I'll grab an example right here. Here we have one, and you will see, despite the fact that this has now got a basket hilt on it, look at that pommel, and it's got the little cat's ears up there. So they evolved the basket hilt. Now, one of the questions always has to be, why does the basket hilt develop? So the basket hilt, interconnected bars that enclose the hand, is something which evolves in certain areas in the 16th century. So it's really an invention of the 16th century. It evolves in certain parts of Germany, certain parts of Britain, and Scandinavia as well, and certain parts of Italy, but specifically Venice. Now, it's not to say you can't find something like a basket hilt in other parts of Italy, but this style of basket hilt is absolutely characteristic of the Venetians, of Venice. Okay? Now, Apart from the interlocking bars as a general concept, they specifically look like this. So you can see, and they are different types. I'll just grab a different example here. They don't always have the same arrangement of bars, but to me they look a bit like leaves or almost a sunburst. And that kind of radiating set of bars, and I'll show you how they're constructed in a minute, that radiating set of bars, despite the fact we might have a different number of bars and a slightly different arrangement of bars, they do look fundamentally similar. So I'll put that one down for a second. The other characteristics of the construction of this basket hilt, which is absolutely particular to the Schiavona and to the Venetian basket hilts, are that the bars at the front radiate from the front quillon, okay? So if we look inside the hilt here, we can see we've actually got a crossbar, so like the front of the cross guard, comes out here, and then the bars explode out of the end of it, and they're actually forge welded on, or as is sometimes the case, the guard is bifurcated at the end and split. So when it's forged, they cut the ends of that cross guard and they spread it out, and I suspect that's how they first evolved, by spreading out the end of the guard. Now this form of creating the front of the basket is particular to the Schiavona. It spreads out of that front guard. The next thing which is absolutely characteristic of the Schiavona is when this front knuckle bow element, which comes around the front of the guard here and protects the front of the hand, meets the pommel, they are connected, or rather not connected, by not very much at all, usually just a ring. So the front of this knuckle bow comes up and rests against that cat's head style pommel. And as you can see here, this has just got a bit of wire connecting it, but originally it would have had a ring in there. So there's not an awful lot connecting the basket to the pommel, unlike, for example, with a Highland Scottish basket hilt, where the end of the knuckle bow actually terminates in a ring, and a ring goes around the grip, and then the pommel goes on top of that. So the Highland basket hilt is much more connected at top and bottom, whereas the Schiavona is really only connected strongly at this end, and it's only connected in this quite flexible way at the back end. The third thing, which is absolutely characteristic of the Schiavona, is the thumb ring. Now, I've spoken about thumb rings before, and I won't go into huge depth at all, in fact, no depth on this video talking about thumb rings. We'll look at thumb rings in greater depth by themselves, but purely to say that the basket hilt of the Schiavona here has a thumb ring. So the thumb literally goes over that ring there, okay? Now, an interesting thing about the Schiavona is some early ones look like they have the capacity for the finger to go over the front of the guard, like fingering the guard, like you'd have for a fingering on a side sword or a rapier. However, as you will see on this example, many Schiavona have a leather tube, essentially, which goes around the ricasso and actually goes around the guard inside the hilt, inside here, and comes down the blade, and that actually sits outside the scabbard. So the scabbard goes up, when you sheath it, the scabbard goes up inside that leather tube. Now that leather tube being there could achieve various things, most of all preventing water from getting into the scabbard. The Venetians, of course, are famous for their navy, so if you're serving on board ships, that would be useful, but just if you're anywhere where it's rainy, helps protect the blade. But as a byproduct of how you hold the sword, it means that while the thumb goes over the thumb ring, you cannot put the finger over the front of the guard because there isn't space to do it in a Schiavona hilt. Even if it looks like there might be, there usually isn't. Now, there might be some exceptions to that, and we've got an example here. Let's switch over to a different one. This has got the original scabbard, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this Schiavona is interesting because you'll notice it still has long guards projecting out. Now, these long cross guards are usually found on earlier Schiavona. So much the same as in England, the original basket hilts of Henry VIII's time still have the cross guard projecting outside of the basket. And then as we get into the Elizabethan period, those get chopped off or curled around to get them out of the way. But you'll notice there's a certain degree of conservatism. So originally they thought, well, swords have crossguards, don't they? A sword must have a crossguard because that's what a sword is like. And so they kept the crossguard projecting outside of the basket. And then gradually, as people got used to the fact that they now had a basket and they didn't really need the crossguard anymore, and moreover, the crossguard's more likely to get caught in clothing and things like this, they abandoned them. But this example is interesting because it still has the crossguard projecting outside the basket. And it does have a thumb ring as well. Now, interestingly, with this example, I can get my finger over the front quillon. So I suspect that originally in the evolution of the Schiavona, there was a period of time when these were designed, and you'll notice the basket projects upwards. So my finger's actually incredibly well protected. Although I've got the finger over the front guard, we've still got a lot of basket up here to protect that front index finger. So I suspect that originally the Schiavona was intended to be used with the thumb through the thumb ring and the finger, the lead finger, over the quillon, and those two things together. And this actually gives you a very, very secure grip. You're extremely unlikely to lose the sword that way. But over time, they seem to have stopped putting the finger over the finger ring, and they just put the fingers around the grip down here. And now I have to say, also from a user point of view, a lot of these hilts are too tight for me to comfortably use, okay? Now, we're talking about the 17th and the 18th century here. On average, the average height of people was a little bit less. Perhaps they were not as well nourished as I was as a child, I don't know. But I do have fairly large hands. So for me personally, this hilt is, I can use it, but it's quite uncomfortable. It's a bit too tight on my hand. I do have an example here which is comfortable for me to use on my hand. So these baskets were made to suit the size of the hand of the person using them. That's not to say that they were all bespokely made. In fact, almost certainly they weren't. These were made as close as we can get it in this period to mass production. But what would have happened is when you go to choose a sword from the armory, or when you go to buy a sword, you pick one that has a hilt which is big enough for your hand. And you simply don't buy the one where the hilt is too small for your hand. So it's as simple as that. So for me personally, if I'm in Venice in the year 1700 and I'm trying to choose a Schiavona, this one I'll be like, oh, that looks nice. I put my hand in it, I go, basket's a bit too tight for me. And I'll move on to find one with a larger hilt on it. Right, so I mentioned that we'd look at the scabbards. Now it's interesting, there's a couple of examples in this sale which have the original scabbards on. And I have to be honest, I have never seen in the flesh an original Schiavona scabbard myself. And I didn't realise they were constructed in this way. So it's very, very interesting. So it is got very thin wood inside, so there's very thin slats of wood covered in leather, which would be typical of any medieval scabbard. But then you will notice this reinforced strip of brass in this case, but some of them were iron, around the end of the scabbard. Now, this is essentially like a chape, but it has parallels with certain other swords in history. Most notably, Mongolian swords often have this, and Chinese swords have this reinforcement on them sometimes. And in that situation, it's usually to help make the sword more durable for cavalry use, because obviously if you're riding on a horse, the end of the scabbard is going to be banging against the stirrups and against your boots and against the side of the horse potentially. So this end of the scabbard is very liable to damage. So reinforcing the end of the scabbard is a very good idea. And it's very likely that many of these Schiavona were employed by the Venetians to equip their cavalry, okay? Not the people on boats, but the people on horses, okay? Because they are essentially cavalry swords, but anybody could carry them in theory. The other famous example of a type of scabbard which has this type of reinforcement is, bizarrely, the Roman gladius, the gladius hispaniensis. And in fact, if we go back to Iberian swords which predate the Romans, they also have this. So in fact, this is a very, very old way of reinforcing what would otherwise be a fairly fragile scabbard. I should also mention, while I've talked about Schiavona having broadsword blades, they don't always. They sometimes have backsword blades, that is a single-edged blade, and sometimes they even have rapier blades. So they can actually have any blade on them, and we still call it a Schiavona. A Schiavona is essentially this style of basket hilt. And if I whip out this example, you'll see that this actually has a fairly slender blade on it that is essentially like a sort of broad rapier blade. I wouldn't quite call it a broadsword, but I wouldn't call it a rapier either. It's somewhere in between the two. It's what McBain would call a shearing sword. So basket hilt, long, beautiful blade with triple fillers. Very, very nice. This is a really nice example. It's just a shame for me that the basket is a little bit too tight for my hand, but it is nevertheless an absolutely beautiful example. Right, on to the third and final example. So as you can see here, this example is a bit bigger, it's a bit heavier, but it has the same type of reinforced scabbard, in this case reinforced with iron, so a strip up each side around the end, and then bands which go around laterally to hold those strips on. Very similar construction to a Roman gladius, or indeed to certain types of Mongol and Chinese sword. But this basket I was happy to find fits my hand perfectly. So this is just a bigger basket, and this is an 18th century example. So we're talking about the 1700s here. So this is the same period as the British were using backswords and Highland broadswords and things like this. And this is a whopping great blade. Almost certainly a cavalry sword, I would say. This is a long, long blade. In fact, I have a tape measure here, so let's just see the length of this out of interest. Wow. So down to the crossguard, it's 40 inches. That is a big, big blade. So it's both broad and long, and it's got quite a lot of distal taper to it, so quite flexible, as you can see. It has some interesting little markings on it. It's also worthy of note that many of these Schiavona actually feature earlier blades. So sometimes we find for example, 16th century cavalry sword or broadsword blade mounted on an 18th century hilt. So it's clear that the Venetians were reusing blades, and that's why we find so many different types of blade mounted on these Schiavona hilts. Now, just to finish off, just to mention, this also has that leather sleeve inside here, which sits around the scabbard, prevents the rain going in. But that does also block my finger, so I can't, if that wasn't there, I could probably put my index finger over, but because that is there, I can't do it. So really all we have for gripping here is a normal conventional grip around the grip, and then the thumb goes over the thumb ring on the inside here. And that basket has plenty of space for my hand either side, and that is an absolutely beautifully handling sword. Big, big blade, not nimble at all. Very, very formidable, a lot of reach, a lot of power, lovely big hilt. So there we go. You'll notice again, this example, as I mentioned before, is not joined at all at the pommel. It just has this curl over, and that's quite a common feature. And theoretically, that would mean that blades coming down here will get caught. But the important thing to note is there's no connection point between the end of the basket and the pommel. And here, this is a really good example of the cat's head, and you can see the little, what would be the face in here with the little ears. But that does trace its ancestry all the way back to these late medieval rectangular pommels there. So there we go, an overview of the Venetian Schiavona. If you've got particular questions or particular aspects of something I might have touched on in this video you'd like me to go into in greater depth, then I'll be happy to in the future get posting in the comments down below. But there we go, first overview of the Venetian Schiavona, its history, its form, its variations, and thanks to Olympia Auctions for letting me get my hands on their lovely examples they've got in the upcoming sale, which is on the 4th of December 2024. I'll stick a link to the catalogue down below. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.